All right, we are recording. Over to you, Alan.
Well, thank you, Catherine, for doing all of the actual hard work and the mechanical side of things of setting this up. Between Catherine's logistic and management support and all of the great presentations you're about to see, it makes the job of the coordinator of this process much, much easier. And you're going to get a chance to see all of the great work that the community has been driving. So it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to the spring SBOM community meeting. We've tried to have these meetings quarterly as a chance for the community to see the progress, check in. It gives the working groups a sort of deliverable deadline, and it gives all of us as a community a chance to sort of ask, where are we and where are we going? And so I'm going to take a moment to give a discussion, a little bit of a discussion around where we've been coming from and where we are today and where we're going. So we'll talk about the agenda in a moment, but quickly just a quick survey of what we've been doing, where we're going to talk about the overall scope of this initiative. I know that there are some new people joining us this week, and we're going to talk a little about the guiding principles behind this initiative. We're going to take a look back because we have come quite a ways for this idea that wasn't new when NTIA started, but we've made a lot of progress. And then we're going to quickly touch base and set up some of the discussion that we're going to have at the end of today's meeting, which is, hey, as we wrap up or start to think about wrapping up this phase, what do we want to do moving forward? So first, what's our scope? Right? How are we thinking about software? And one thing that we want to emphasize is that we're looking at the entire software supply chain. So one of the working groups, the Awareness and Adoption Group, has sort of framed this in terms of supply chain. So we have parts that get moved into compound parts, which get put into final goods assembled, and then are used by operators or customers. And supply chain transparency means meeting the needs of each of those components, whether it's sort of a small upstream open source project or the large corporation using some massive embedded device and everything in between. We want to make sure that we're covering those use cases and meeting those needs, or if we're not, being explicit about why. And we also have an emphasis on the fact that this is a cross-sector initiative. We all use the same software and will all be at a disservice to each other if we have one solution over here and another solution over here. So a lot of our effort has been to make sure that we can reconcile the use cases between what we might need for modern enterprise software or the automotive sector, the energy sector, the healthcare sector, government, making sure that we can meet those needs, but making sure that we're not forking this and creating a new approach. And so what NTIA is trying to do is capture the private sector needs and the public sector needs to bring together this effort. Public-private partnerships have become a little bit of a cliche in the DC cybersecurity world, but I'm very happy with what we've been able to do of really bringing together these voices and different perspectives in a same space. And the community really has been exemplary in hearing each other, in listening to each other, and making sure that we can reflect our various needs and interests. So what are some of the principles that have been carrying us through this effort? First is an emphasis on transparency and openness. Anyone can join this process, and we have folks from all walks of life. We have folks from some of the biggest corporations in the world to some people from 1 or 2 person outfits who are just starting off on the entrepreneurial direction, and everyone in between. We've got academics, we've got people from around the world. I'm very excited on this call to see friends from Europe and Japan, so we're really covering the entire planet. We've also emphasized the idea that we're not going to solve this entire problem immediately right off the bat. And rather than trying to build some glorious, perfect solution that may eventually see the light of day, we're really emphasizing a mantra of crawl, walk, run. Let's see what we can do today. Let's start off direct, but make sure that everything we're doing is built to be able to scale and be more ambitious and more extensive. We've also emphasized the idea that when possible, don't invent anything new. If we want to help people adopt things. Let's use what they're already doing. Now, sometimes that's challenging, especially when different communities are doing different things. And so we've emphasized the idea of harmonization between those different efforts. Similarly, we know that SBOM won't solve all of our problems. And so we want to make sure that we can build this in a modular fashion so that it can dock with, it can complement other efforts. And then lastly, getting back to that previous point I made about the differences from different communities, we want to harmonize our efforts across different communities, different use cases, while still allowing some flexibility so that people can say, yes, this is what I need for my community. We're not ready here, or we need a higher assurance use case here, or we need to adapt this or integrate this with this approach that we're already doing. And that, I think, has been very powerful, especially as we've gotten into the proof of concept model. So this effort that we're currently engaged in and worked in started in 2018, but actually goes much before that. SBOM is not a new idea. I want to be very clear about that. Certainly NTIA didn't invent it. It had been talked about in the academic world since the 90s. It's built on a whole bunch of efforts, including the practice of and the study of configuration management. And indeed, going back to the middle of the 20th century with the entire revolution of supply chain management in the industrial age, SBOM is the natural progression to that. But one of the things we try to do for NTIA is to say, hey, listen, we've been talking about this idea. How can we make progress on it? How can we bring the whole community together to define what we need? And so for the first phase, once we as a community sort of organized ourselves into working groups, was focused on a descriptive side of things. I like to think of it as the what, the why, and the how. And these are some of the foundational deliverables that are on ntia.gov/SBOM, starting with the framing document, which some of you have sort of begun to treat as sort of a founding document or a constitution of SBOM, saying this is the basics. We've defined we'll come up with some definitions as well as this minimum viable approach. We've also established use cases and thought about the roles and benefits. And so this is, again, a very powerful document that came out in 2019 that looked at the roles and benefits, saying, hey, there are going to be different merits for engaging this. And some of them are security approaches, but some of them are actually just financial. And it's going to help you whether you make software or whether you choose software or whether you operate software. So we have the what, we have the why, and of course we did some work on the how. And we, as I mentioned, didn't want to invent a brand new standard. And fortunately, there are 3 standards out there, and we've emphasized interoperability. So we have SPDX, we have CycloneDX, and we have SWID, and we have folks that are interested in working in all of those data formats, as well as working together. Right? We all understand that even though each data format has its own community and its own perspective, we're all going to be better off if we can harmonize and work together. And I think that's really been a great sign of the progress being made. And of course, here's the slide with the interoperability here. And then lastly, the other thing that we started off as we launched was to say, hey, can we do this today? And it's really impressive, the leadership that's been shown by the healthcare community and by the medical device community, where they basically said, we want to show that this is possible today. We think it's possible. Let's go try to build it. And they've done so in an iterative and creative fashion. So they've focused on defining some of the use cases they want to use this data for. And then they said, let's validate that we can do this. And let's talk as a community about the challenges of generating SBOM data and then making sure that data can be used in the way that we think it should be. And that really has, I think, set a strong direction for other communities that we'll be talking about today. So in 2019, the very end of 2019, we published these documents. And this is one of our last in-person, I think our last in-person meeting. The community said, we've done this much, but we need to do more. It's not just enough to publish some documents on a website. Let's focus on operationalizing this. And so the framing working group said, well, what are the further architectural barriers that we need to do to operationalize SBOM? The folks that were focused on data formats said, well, let's expand our focus to the tools, and we'll keep an eye on what formats the tools talk about, but we also want to really have our emphasis be on what they can do. The use cases group said, we've now described how this can benefit people. Let's show people how this can benefit them. And let's focus on awareness and adoption. And similarly, the healthcare group said, let's keep refining this. Let's make sure that we're expanding the capability and make sure that we can continue to demonstrate its value. And they've also served as a leadership example for other communities. So I'm going to steal a little bit of thunder from some of the working groups today, because the deliverables that they've published are quite powerful. The framing group, for example, has written a great white paper on the challenge of software identity. And they said, listen, we're not going to solve this. We can't dictate that everyone use a single solution, but we can at least identify some good rules of the road and a path to harmonization. They also try to explicitly address, hey, how are SBOMs actually going to get from the supplier to those who need it? And they've done some good work, again, with a similar white paper saying there isn't going to be a single one-size-fits-all approach, but we can break down the problem. We can, for example, decompose it into discovery and access, and then we can sort of suggest some of the solutions so that we're not trying to deal with an infinite problem space, but a much smaller set. And lastly, you're going to hear today from a couple of different working groups on a real challenge that the entire security community is going to have to think about, which is not all vulnerabilities actually put users or humans at risk. And so the framing group has a subgroup that's focused on what we're calling VEX, Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange, that can allow someone to communicate related to but separate from the SBOM this notion that this vulnerability does not affect this piece of software. On the tooling side, they've been doing some great work on things like the first Plug Fest, where we brought together different folks who who have built SBOM tools today, including people who generate SBOMs and folks who consume SBOMs, and say, hey, let's take a small sample of pieces of software and show what we can do with them. And similarly, they've developed this taxonomy for SBOM tools that's been published. And in terms of the awareness and adoption side, they've done a great job of communicating the value of SBOM. They've written an FAQ where they continue updating it. There are some great resources for presentations as more and more people are out there carrying the flag of SBOM to their community. And there's some great summary resources, such as the two-pager and an SBOM at a glance. And they just published this great idea of Sbomb Options, which helps people say when I'm asking for an SBOM or when I'm supplying an SBOM, it's not just enough to talk about the baseline components. What are some of the other dimensions to think about? And they'll talk about that today. The healthcare group, the proof of concept, has not only continued to expand this, and in fact, occasionally race ahead so that they're on the bleeding edge of SBOM consideration for things like VEX, but they're also inspiring other industries. We're going to hear a little later this afternoon from the automotive sector, which has been starting some work under the auspices of the Auto ISAC, and the energy sector, the bulk power sector, where the NTI community has been partnering with the Department of Energy and the national labs to say, hey, what does this look like in the energy sector? And we're hearing more interest from other sectors who are hopefully going to be making some public announcements soon. So what's the future here? There's going to be continuing government activity. We've seen FDA and healthcare leading the way. We've talked about energy and automotive. There's federal interest in this. And this is also something that has a lot of draw around the world. So we're already seeing this, for example, in standards from ENISA on things like IoT or cloud security. And the goal here is basically to say, what are the common set of practices and market expectations, and how do we align this with other efforts? So taking a step back, SBOM won't solve all of our problems. But wherever you are in the software world, the change that we know that we need to make, whether it's having better secure development processes and better evidence of that, better pre-purchase risk management or supply chain evaluation issues, or if we're operating software, better vulnerability management, all of these things require SBOM as a key point to move forward. And that's something we're really trying to do, is to help everyone realize that this is something we can do that will really have a multiplicative effect moving forward. So now we get to sort of tease, how do we think about the next phase? We've talked about the basics, the what, the why, and the how. We've spent the last year thinking about operationalizing SBOM. What do we need to do as we make sort of one more pivot and one more adjustment here? How do we think about obstacles for greater adoption? How do we lower the costs for people? What are other non-cost barriers? How do we foster market demand? If SBOM is going to scale to be truly automatable, what are some of those obstacles? And then how can SBOM align with and complement other efforts? So, wanted to start those conversations. We're going to revisit them later in the agenda. But we're going to start off today by hearing from the different working groups. I've teased a little bit of what we're going to hear. We're going to get a little more detail. I've asked everyone to do just a little background about what it is that they've worked on in the past, as well as highlight, but not to spend too much time on the past, but highlight really what's the great work they've done. In the last 3 short months since our last meeting, I'm really blown away by the amount of progress that's been made by the working groups. And so we're going to hear from the different working groups. We're going to take a short break in the middle, and then we're going to hear from the last working group. We're going to get a very short readout from these nascent proof of concept exercises that I talked about from the automotive and energy community. And then we're going to have a chance as a community to talk about what do we think of as we set up the next steps. So with that, I will pause. The last thing I'll say is the chat is available if you have questions or comments, and so that we can chime in and hear from you. This is going to be a recorded meeting so that folks who can't make it are aware of it. So just as a flag for when you choose to speak publicly, and when you don't, the chat will not be recorded, so you can speak with a little more freedom in the chat. And then when we come to discussion time, what we'll do is we'll raise our hands through the Teams interface, and then Catherine and I will make sure that you can have the floor. Okay, with that said, thank you. There's a quick question in the chat of will the slides be made available? Yes, the slides, early draft slides are already available on the NTIA website at ntia.gov/software transparency. I'll put that link in the chat, and we'll make sure that if there's any updates to the slides that are presented today, that we include those. Okay, with that being said, we are going to start with the framing group, which is very ably led by Michelle Jump and Art Mannion. Oops. Michelle, we may not be able to hear you.
There we go.
There we go. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Hi, Michelle. Hi, Alan. Thanks.
Just getting ready to share my screen. Okay. Hopefully you guys can see me.
Yep.
Okay. So thanks everybody for joining today. And Alan, thanks for that great intro as always. This presentation is going to go over the framing group, as Alan mentioned. This group, Art Mannion and I have been co-chairing this group with love and patience, as we like to say, since this group's inception in July 2018. Kind of crazy to think that we've been doing this for 3 years, huh, Art? But this group has been meeting regularly on Fridays at 2 p.m. Eastern time. If you'd like to join what we're doing, you are welcome to use this link in the slide deck. My name is Michelle Jump. I work for MedSec, Global Regulatory Advisor and Medical Device Cybersecurity. And then I'll just pass it over, Art, if you'd like to just introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Michelle. Audio okay?
Yep.
Good. Hi, everyone. Art Mannion. I work at the CERT Coordination Center. My day job is basically in the vulnerability management and coordination world, but sorting out what we like to call multi-vendor vulnerabilities, which are basically supply chain problems, has led me to the need for SBOM, or the need for good inventory information, so we know who's affected by security vulnerabilities. And that's why I got involved here. So thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, sir. All right, we have basically four topics to update everyone on. We always like to start with a bit of an SBOM refresher. We know that people are potentially joining us for the first time. If you guys have been on this on the long haul, might be a good time to get a little coffee. But I will go through what we usually do, which is talk a little bit about the SBOM baseline, give you guys a little bit of a background, and then we'll talk about some newly released documents we have, some ongoing efforts, and an update on BEX, which Alan mentioned already for us. So if you're here, you probably have some idea what an SBOM is, but I think it's important, we have a number of documents that we've released out into the world on ntia.gov/SBOM. But sometimes, when folks start with, say, one of the other documents, they miss this, what is an SBOM actually? And that's something that we do capture in our framing report from phase 1. So we talk about what is an SBOM, what does it mean by baseline component information, and then what I like to call, kind of the care and feeding of an SBOM. When do you create it? How do you create it? How do you exchange it? Some basic things to get you started thinking about SBOMs and kind of how this group thinks about SBOMs. But all an SBOM is effectively a nested inventory, a list of ingredients that make up your software components. So they're important because it's important to know what's in a product to understand the vulnerability profile of that product. So one of the big objectives here would be to say, how are we defining an SBOM by the parts that are involved, right? So what we have here on this screen is two models that are demonstrating the same thing. The top one I kind of call the ball and stick model. It's a little bit more diagrammatic to show how things are related. The bottom figure there is more of a spreadsheet approach. We understand that both of these are more visual, human readable. As you get into complex SBOMs that go nested deeply into the product with lots of components, really going with a machine readable approach is much more effective and efficient. But for the purposes of this discussion, to just see what we're talking about, what an SBOM is, we're showing it you in this simplified form. So in both of these cases, the blue item is the system under discussion, right? So Acme application is the product that we're talking about. That's the final good assembled. And in each of these, they consist of Bingo Buffer and Bob's Browser are both included in that Acme application. And then we also know that Bob's Browser also contains Carol's compression engine. So the information that we're providing here is the component name, supplier name, version string, author. The author is kind of important because sometimes you have to create an SBOM for a component that you're using. It may not have actually come from the source. So if you look at Bob's Browser, you see that the SBOM actually came from the supplier. But in the case of the Bingo Buffer, the final good assembled supplier is actually creating the SBOM for that Bingo Buffer. So then having your hash, a unique identifier, and the relationship. So those are the baseline expectations of an SBOM as we have currently defined them. So if anyone has any questions about this, obviously Art and I are always available. Oh, thanks, Duncan. I didn't realize that was showing up for you guys. We're always available to kind of chat if you want to go through a little bit more of an expansive discussion about this. So since we last met, we talked about these two draft papers that were going to be available. They have now been released. We have two discussion papers, one on sharing and one on identity. So if you'd like to find those papers, they are on this website, ntia.gov/SBOM. Under new documents, you will find the new documents that we have recently released in case you'd like to download them and take a look at them yourself. The first one is on sharing and exchanging SBOMs. We talked a little bit about this in our initial framing document. But this discussion paper really is intended to talk a lot more about how do you get SBOMs into the hands of those who need to use them. So there's discussions, there's not necessarily one single way. There are a lot of options, as we do a lot in our NTIA work here. We're not dictating how people should do things or how people will do things, but providing options, trying to rely on best practices and currently available options. So the first discussion paper here is on sharing and exchanging SBOMs. You can read a little bit more if you're thinking about how you're going to get your SBOMs into the hands of the right entities that need them at the right time. We have one more slide here around an update recently from one of our members, Elliot Lear. Art, did you want to give the update on this particular slide?
Sure. Yeah, no problem. This is not a, this is just a, I think the main point here is one of our working group members and one of the community members here also works with the IETF. And Elliot, in this case, has worked a lot. One of the two papers Michelle mentioned is about sharing and exchanging SBOMs. And we wanted to highlight this IETF effort as effectively, right, the SBOM work is progressing. It is having impact. Alan mentioned some of the other places in the world that are looking at this, whether those are governments or regulators or other standards organizations. So, IETF, famous for protocols that make the internet work, has a effort here in the ops area working group to look at how to programmatically exchange and share SBOM information. So again, kind of the core message here is not the details yet. This is an early effort, and IETF is open, so participation is of course welcome. Just that while the NTIA SBOM effort is handling certain things, we can't solve entire world's problems. So it's great to see efforts like this that we are collaborating with and that are going beyond the confines of the NTIA SBOM effort. Thanks, Michelle. I think that's it.
Thank you. Then our other discussion paper that was really recently released and is available on that same link above is a software identification challenges and guidance. This is a particularly sticky problem because what you call your components and what you call your suppliers and how you write these things up really needs to be fairly consistent. If it's not consistent, you have things like Windows 10, Win 10, all kinds of different options that you can write either the component or the supplier name, which means that when you have, say, the user of the SBOM trying to collate all this information and do any kind of analysis, it's really hard to parse the trends that you have and to pull everything together because things aren't called the same thing. So this paper captures a lot of those challenges and then provides some guidance on how you can address them. Again, we're not giving you one single solution in many of these. We don't have the authority nor the ability to do that, but we can provide information to help guide teams and groups as they're continuing to try to work on developing good best practices and kind of rules of engagement while they're working on SBOMs. Next, we're going to move to our ongoing efforts. We're working on a couple of different areas right now, currently in phase 2. We got those draft reports out. That was our biggest objective within our last update in January. Right now, we're working on reviewing the baseline SBOM, so that the SBOM, that ball and stick, and the spreadsheet model that I showed you earlier in the slide deck is what we call the baseline SBOM, which means if you want to say you have an SBOM, you really need to have these essential parts. Now, we've had this report out for our initial framing report out that defined this baseline for a good year and a half or so, maybe. All right, I don't remember when we exactly put it out, maybe 2 years. We've been taking notes as we've been going through, and we're going to be reopening the framing report to do a little bit of an update. Now, the baseline is not going to necessarily change, but there have been questions that have come up that we thought would be helpful to clarify. And we're also going to be going into this concept that's called beyond the baseline, meaning the baseline allows you to do basic functionality utilizing SBOMs. But there are other things you can do and add to that SBOM to enhance the usability and the utility of an SBOM further than you might if you just had the baseline. So we're going to be expanding the concepts around the beyond the baseline ideas and talking a little bit more about that in potential updates to the framing report. There's some other things that we want to clarify just in learning since the report has been out, but we do plan to rev that document to provide more information and clarity. Again, not changing the baseline and the components in the baseline, but more clarifying and expanding a bit on what the beyond the baseline elements are. Another big focus area that we have is on VEX. How do we understand the exploitability status of a particular vulnerability for a particular finished product? So we're going to have a considerable more update on that in just a moment. And then lastly, something that we all feel is a pretty important area. We're not going to go into any detail on it right now, but our group is preparing a glossary of a common set of terms that we use in a way that is unique to what we're doing, or it's very important we clarify how we're using certain terms within the scope of the NTIA effort. So let's all try to speak the same language and make sure that we're all clear when we say a particularly important term that we're talking about the same thing. So I think at this point, I'm going to pass it on to Art to talk a little bit more about the framing group report that's under revision.
Great, thanks, Michelle. We talk sometimes about phases in the framing group, and phase one was roughly the first year, and demarked for us by our initial document. So the phase one framing document is sort of the lingo we use. This has been out for over a year now, and one thing, as Michelle mentioned, we've been sort of collecting things that might need to be revised in that paper, in that guidance. So that's sort of been an ongoing collection. Perhaps more importantly, this treatment of baseline and extensions or beyond baseline attributes of SBOMs is going to be is probably one of our next. It is one of our next priorities and focuses. So Michelle mentioned earlier in the about SBOM slide. What are the baseline attributes that you would need to identify a component to make up, what is a software, how do I identify a software ingredient within other software? We're kind of reviewing that to make sure that information is still valid and solid. We don't expect any serious changes, but some clarified language, some improvements there. And following that sort of treatment of our core baseline, we'll be looking at defining parts of the SBOM model that are necessary to support kind of the interesting use cases that you'd have for SBOM. So I mentioned when I first got on, I come from essentially the vulnerability management world. Vulnerability management and coordination and analysis is certainly I consider the greatest use case for SBOM. There are many, many, many other use cases. Anyone who has looked at the open source licensing lists for software, that's already a place where SBOM is being used today. So licensed intellectual property, there are many other uses for SBOMs, but the very core is essentially, does the ingredients list work? Do we have it? And that is the baseline minimum requirement. And then the beyond baseline or extensions would be, and I need to do other things in order to do vol management or license management or intellectual property rights management, or do a more high assurance pedigree provenance sort of analysis. Slide, please, Michelle. I think you're driving. Thanks. So taking the vulnerability management use case or application of SBOM, very quickly this turns into, I've got a list of ingredients and I've got a list of vulnerabilities. I need to tie those together in order to go do my vulnerability management work. So, right, is a component, is an upstream library affected by a vulnerability? Is an operating system in my product affected by a vulnerability? Is an operating system kernel of a certain version affected by a vulnerability? And that's all. That's one thing, to map the vulnerability to some component. But the real question that we've stumbled across here is, what does that mean for downstream components in the supply chain? And it turns out that even if there's a vulnerability in an upstream component, 1, 2, 3, 4, many hops or layers up the supply chain, it is not at all a sure thing or clear that that vulnerability transitively flows down and affects the final good assembled of the product I'm looking at. So VEX is an effort to figure out how to convey that information, how to convey that degree of exploitability from an upstream dependency down to a final good assembled. In some cases, we're trying to design VEX in a way that it can be used all by itself without necessarily having SBOM around. But for the main purposes of this slide and this discussion here, we're connecting the ingredients list from SBOM with the, if you will, a list of CVE identifiers or a vulnerability database set of identifiers, mapping those together, and then conveying how exploitable the dependencies are down through the supply chain. And one of the immediate use cases, of course, everyone wants to know, right, is this product vulnerable? Do I have to do something because of an upstream dependency vulnerability? Of course, that's important. What is, in fact, equally important and not talked about less is, am I not vulnerable because of the upstream dependency? And good news in this world, if you have confidence you are not affected by something, you get to stop working on it and spend your time elsewhere. So the not affected, or the degree of not affectedness, turns out to be one of the main focuses of our VEX effort. Slide, please, Michelle. Okay, sorry, I got ahead of myself a bit here, but we're looking at, right, the union, the mapping of the SBOM inventory component to the vulnerability database identifier. VEX is a statement about that union and a degree of claim, statement, assertion about the degree of vulnerability. And again, I just covered this a little bit prematurely, but the not affected, no action necessary, go spend your time elsewhere is, becomes a very, very important both security and economic bit of knowledge to have. And we want to be careful here. The entire SBOM initiative and this piece, the VEX piece here, we're trying to figure out ways to clearly convey information. A downstream consumer of SBOM or of VEX statements still has to make their own risk decision. They have to decide to patch, to not patch, to firewall off a vulnerable system, take a mitigating action, apply a compensating control, or do nothing, take no action because they're not vulnerable. That decision still has to happen. We want to give people better information to make those decisions with. Slide, please, Michelle. So Alan covered this, where we've got well, somewhat informal, but an ad hoc working group within the framing working group focused on VEX. And that work to date has come up with this selection of data we think is necessary for this VEX statement or this VEX record. So certainly we have to connect to the software components we're talking about. There's some information about the VEX statement, so metadata about the VEX, who wrote it, when they wrote it. Do you want to have them digitally sign their statement? And then for the vulnerability piece of the VEX, of course, you need to identify the vulnerability, so a CVE ID or something else to identify the vulnerability. Something about the status of the vulnerability. Further details may end up being supporting the status information. So if status is not affected, further details may be why we're saying it's not affected. For instance, that code does not exist, or that code is not reachable, would be claims that would support not affected. And again, preliminary work in an ad hoc here, but this has been a topic of much discussion for probably over a year, and we aim to provide some guidance so that, again, the essential issue here is, there's a vulnerability in an upstream component. SBOM tells me that exists now. Do I need to worry about it or not? And VEX will help me make that decision. Slide, please, Michelle. In terms of sort of working group progress here, we've been talking to a group within the OASIS Standards Organization, CSAF, Common Security Advisory Framework standard, which is, if anyone is familiar with CVRF, Common Vulnerability Reporting Format, CSAF is now the home, has been for a while, the home of CVRF. So CSAF is, a vulnerability security advisory sort of format standard. And it should be no surprise to anyone, if you're talking about vulnerabilities, you'll often see a line in an advisory called systems affected, and that is the intersection with SBOM. So we're working closely with the CSAF group here to figure out what already exists. Alan mentioned an important principle: don't create a new thing if you can use an existing one. So that's part of the reason for working within CSAF and talking to those folks. And they are, it's a very nice collaboration. Everyone's working very nicely together. Potentially, if this VEX work comes up, reveals the need for different sorts of status or different CSAF information, it's quite possible CSAF would make modifications as well. Although we're a bit ahead of the cart on that one. Working drafts on the status of the vulnerability. We're looking at no not affected, which is the economically great choice of nothing to see here, move on and go work on a different problem. No action necessary, and possibly some further detail for those who want it on here's why we are making that not affected claim. There's affected, known affected, right? And the definition is sort of anchoring around something needs to happen. I need to take action. Very commonly that's a patch, but we mentioned a risk decision earlier. It might be something else, but something needs to happen. The upstream vulnerability somehow affects the downstream product. If you're a downstream product user, owner, operator, you have something to go do. Under investigation and fixed entirely are also under consideration here. Yes, thank you, Vex.
Well, and thank you to the whole working group. Just to wrap this up, thank you for your attention here, folks. But we also want to thank our amazing working group for all their hard work. We definitely would not be where we are today. We get to share all the great work we've done, but behind the scenes, there's a very dedicated group of individuals who have day jobs who have helped make all this happen. So thank you to them.
Yes, thank you, working group. I think we're out here, right, Michelle? Sorry.
Yes, we are, sir.
Okay.
And I don't think we're taking questions.
Thank you, Art and Michelle. If folks have, I want to try to keep us on the schedule if we can. But if folks do have questions, we'll put them in the chat. I see there's one hand raised. Put them in the chat and we'll be sure to try to address them because as we move on, you'll see how the different working groups work related and builds on each other. And of course, Art and Michelle highlighted a key important part, which is all of this work exists because of those who volunteered to join the calls and participate in the mailing lists. And so thank you. And that's something we'll try to repeat over the course of this event. So we've talked about the high-level architecture side of things. And now we're going to go from sort of the blueprints to the coalface, if I want to truly butcher some engineering metaphors. And so we'll turn things over to Kate Stewart and JC Hertz, who are the co-coordinators for the Formats and Tooling Working Group.
Sounds good, Alan. Is this now visible? Because I'll go into present mode.
We can see your slides and we can hear you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And so JC and myself have been working with this group pretty much since the start. And we were initially meeting bi-weekly, but there's so much happening that we're now into a weekly meeting cadence. And we are basically taking the concepts from framing and applying them and making sure that we have formats available to support them. And there's tooling out there to actually make it usable in the field. JC, do you want to just introduce yourself quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is JC Hertz. I run Ion Channel, which is a software supply chain assurance platform, mostly in critical infrastructure and defense. So my main experience is in high assurance environments.
And I'm a VP here at the Linux Foundation, working on dependable embedded systems, and have been caring about the whole software bill of materials and for several years now, through many jobs. So with that, today what we would like to talk about a bit is just to remind people what the goals of the work group are, and then look at the formats just so you've got the context for the rest of the information. Talk a bit about the taxonomy, because we did an update this release in this last quarter, and then go through where we are with the playbooks we've been working towards. And we held our first Plug Fest this quarter, and so I'll give some feedback from that, and then go into the directions and see if you've got any time left to try to get some requests for you guys. So just to remind folks, when we identified these needs at the end of phase 1, the tooling gaps and the documenting the processes, and the Plug Fest is starting to highlight this, the gaps. And so hopefully they'll be green soon, or as green as it's going to get. And then the playbooks we're working on to address the documenting processes. We've got various tooling out there, and we've got ways of documenting it. And there are there's translation tools between the different types of formats. And so we're obviously trying to nurture and encourage that. So the 3 formats that we've worked with is SPDX, Cyclone DX, and SWID. And in the slides, you'll find links to them, and you can go and look at the latest versions. Now, since we've put out the initial formats document, a lot of things have changed, and we've taken an input from the framing group and refined some of the specs. So you'll see new versions of the specs coming out, and we'll be updating the formats document. So look for that in this next quarter. One of the other things that's emerged out of there is there's the software identifiers. These are the ones that we found in commercial use as emerging identifiers. So there's the CPE, which is associated with the MBD, but there's also package URLs as a way of referring to components in the wild, and then SWID tags, and then software heritage IDs have persistent IDs. So you may see references to these as well. Now, obviously we wanted to work on those objectives that you saw from the start. We basically had the criteria, and we've worked on what the field definitions need to be and what sort of extensions we needed. And getting that translation happening, you'll see in the tooling and taxonomy inside of it. And then the playbooks, we've taken the perspective of a supplier and a consumer, and working, and JC will go into those into more detail later in the slides. And then initially we added into the objective in this last quarter, which is, get a reference corpus of examples based on the feedback we had at the last meetings. So we're using the Plug Fest to identify gaps. We're working through some common examples between all the tools, and eventually these will become reference examples for others to consult when they're trying to figure out what the way to do it things are. So what we've got right now for a minimum viable SBOM is, these are the NTIA fields. And what we've got the ability to do is each of the formats has a way of representing it. And so we can interoperate for these fields at least. And we're trying to make sure we work towards extending it beyond these fields, because each of these formats has other areas of specialization. So some of the tools that are out there right now is the Sbomb tool has been done by the CERT folk and has been made available, and it was very useful in the proof of concepts. So thank you to Vijay for his tool, and it's available up on GitHub. Anyone can go look at it, and it lets you switch between the different file formats between Cyclone, SWID, and SPDX for these main fields. Decoder ring will go between SPDX and SWID, and the sources are available on GitHub as well for that one. And then the SPDX tools, SPDX supports, 6 file formats, implement it, like, 6 different ways of serializing it, the model. And so there's tools available online for moving between these formats. So if you've got something in JSON and you want to move it over to, a spreadsheet, these types of options are there. And those tools are made available online by the community. And then the CycloneDX community is also has tools, a command line tool that lets you go back and forth between XML and JSON, and also to the SPDX tag value too. So getting the interoperability happening between all these tools we all recognize is something that we're going to need to work on, and the pieces are emerging. Now, all of the tools that we know about, we've used a certain taxonomy for classifying them. And we did some updates specifically in terms of how we sort of called a few things. So you can sort of see our documents will be updated on the tool taxonomy to sort of reflect this. There was a couple of other suggestions sort of that emerged later, and we'll assess it in a little bit, but we're sort of standardizing to this taxonomy right now for any tooling we get made aware of. So if you're producing it, which lines up with playbook side, but you're either maybe doing it during a build, or you may be doing it after a build, analyzing a binary or analyzing sources, or you may want to do something where you're using some tooling, but you're also doing a manual edit on top of it. For consume, what you're looking at is you want to be able to view it. You may want to compare a couple, or you may want to import it into your own system because you've got your own database and you want to be able to pull in an SBOM and work with it in your system and augment the data with further information that's relative to your organization. And then there's a case of tools that are transforms where you are changing things from one file type to the other file type, preserving the same information, which was all examples you just saw on the last slide. You may want to merge multiple sources of SBOM data together, or you may need to have libraries so that you can hook up and work with these formats in your own tooling infrastructure. So you can sort of create your own tools and then use these libraries so that it's easier to generate. So that's how we've classified what's there. And the document has been published out on NTIA's site now. And so if you want to look into more details and sort of study it a bit, please go download it. And if you've got questions, show up at the call or post onto the mailing list. So our next steps is continue to building up the tool collections. We've been working everything in a Google Docs today, and anyone can go in and add comments in if they know of a tool that they don't see on the list already. We would welcome that very much. We're working with Alan to get a space on GitHub so we can move this and put this more under version control and make it a bit more open in terms of the processes, and then clarify the governance rules for this. Right now, the process is each of these documents has a person in charge of accepting the comments, so to speak. And what we're trying to do is, make sure that someone's knowledgeable, so that if someone asserts something, there's a way of checking it, either be it a produce, consumer, transform. So we're sort of looking for evidence before things get added onto the documents. But we want to codify that a little bit more and make sure it's a little bit clearer for everyone. And with that, I'll turn over to JC.
All right. So one of the things that we've also been doing in this group as the kind of more implementation focused group is to come up with playbooks for using these tools in operations. So SBOM, once you understand what it is and its value, how do these things actually get used? Because if they're just great standards that no one understands how to use, there's not a lot of value there on a business level. And so creating these playbooks for what it means end to end to both produce and consume these is important to get folks started and give people a running start. So we have playbooks both for SBOM generation as well as for SBOM consumption. Although we're fully aware that most organizations are both consumers and producers, ultimately, of SBOMs. They're somewhere in the supplier network, in the supply chain. It's an ecosystem. And one of the things that makes ecosystems complex is that there are different roles in them, right? So you might be a supplier of software. There are very few suppliers who write everything from scratch, right? Most of us are intermediaries. There are integrators who put together components or systems or subsystems from different suppliers and then furnish them on to the customer, right? And that's a vital role in the ecosystem. And those folks need to both take SBOMs and produce SBOMs. There might be, first party developers. So you're an enterprise and you have people inside your organization and they are taking external components. So this is more of a DevOps use case. Procurement, increasingly organizations are asking their suppliers to provide SBOMs, sometimes as a condition of procurement, right? So before we buy this advanced AI/ML capability, we want to know what's in it. And so there's even a vendor and supplier management function there, and compliance, right? And these are the external authorities that have to know whether it's a regulator in the case of an FDA for a medical device or an insurer or some kind of external certifier that's giving you certification so that you can enter a particular regulated market. And within that, there's also different use cases, right? So procurement, vulnerability management, entitlement management, and software lifecycle management. And that's one of the reasons why this initiative is so important and why it's important to actually understand the workflow for all these different processes to use SBOMs. Next slide. Kate,
Oh, sorry. Oops, I went too far, right?
So go back one, the supplier. Oh, forward one. Okay. So consumers, the consumer playbook is in draft and we're accepting comments for it, and the links are earlier in this presentation. So we start with the acquisition of an SBOM from a supplier, right? So it's already come in. The workflow, and there are several ways to solve for all of these steps, right? It's a pipeline process. So we're being very careful not to be prescriptive about this is the tool that you should use for this. In some cases, some of these processes are manual, some of them are automated, some for their third-party solutions for, some an organization might decide it wants to create internally. But this is the pipeline process for consumption, is we have an SBOM. And for that information to be important and useful, it has to go from a file into data, right? That flows into something, as opposed to just a reference document for audit. So there's an ingestion of an SBOM, and then we're pulling the information out. How does this thing get parsed? And this is why it's really, really important that we have these formats, because the formats being standardized give tools and stakeholders standard ways to pull information out. Then there's the step that Michelle referred to before, right? The software entity resolution. So sometimes what we find is that the format of an SBOM might be completely valid and correct, but the content and the quality of the underlying data, people call different software different names, right? So there's always some step of software entity resolution to understand for any given component what that authoritatively is. And sometimes in very sophisticated suppliers will furnish external identifiers that'll point to a package manager or a CPE or some other identifier. Often they don't, because often these things are coming from legacy processes and they don't have that information. So there's this process of software entity resolution to determine authoritatively what are those components that are in the SBOM. And then that information, once resolved, can flow into different third-party processes and platforms. And so we're talking about things like your security operations center for the vulnerability management, your configuration management, your software asset management, supply chain risk, vendor management. You might have terms and conditions for your suppliers and your vendors about their security posture and their active maintenance. And so this is where an SBOM would also go. And that becomes the basis of a discussion between the consumer or the customer and the supplier around, what's their security SLA, what can they expect? And we're not prescribing any particular policy or best practice, because most of these things boil down to, these are going to be pairwise negotiations between customers and suppliers. there's going to be different kinds of leverage, but everybody knows where they are with regard to what is being sold and the composition status of what it is. And the VEX document moves into that as well. Then there's ongoing monitoring, because as I like to say, software ages like milk, not like fine wine. And so there may not be any known risks today against a particular software bill of materials, but tomorrow there might be. And one of the big changes is we go from a batch one-time process to a system of continuous authorization, whereby people are expected to maintain software and update it, because that's where a lot of the risk lives. And lastly, looking at the IP and confidentiality status of SBOMs and their underlying data, right? So in order to be useful, the data has to be able to flow. This data might be confidential, right? And an SBOM might be delivered under NDA and used for internal business purposes. And we absolutely understand how to do that, whether it's a corporate NDA or some kind of government privileged status. It is important to treat that information appropriately and to protect it. Next slide. So from the supplier side, and this gets into a lot of the tooling, there's a similar kind of pipeline process. We're defining supplier very broadly here to include, it could be commercial vendor, it could be a contractor who's developing an application for a client, it could be an open source supplier who is developing and maintaining an open source library, right? All of these people are suppliers. And this is part of the sort of the shock of the supply chain, is realizing, that guy over there who is working part-time on a Python library is in fact your supplier, but he is. So there's a divergence between things that are developed using what fairly modern engineering processes, so Git and continuous integration, continuous delivery, pipeline, and then legacy stuff. And having dealt with both, right, we have to treat the SBOM production slightly differently, because if a system was developed 16 years ago and its composition is maintained on a spreadsheet, that's different than if you have a software factory that you've just set up and you can integrate some tooling to spit out an SBOM. And we have to acknowledge the real world, the actual practice. There is a lot of legacy. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't produce an SBOM if you have a legacy system. You can and you should. It's just that you may not have as many tools and capabilities available to you to make it quick, efficient, and verifiable. So the supplier playbook deals with both those scenarios. We also talk about the scope, right? What is in the SBOM? What is the SBOM understood to include, right? And this is very important, right? So for a single application and its compiled dependencies, that is a simple example of, okay, well, here's the SBOM for it. What's still in discussion is items like, oh, well, does this software application call out to external services? Does it fetch something from Google Maps, right? That's an SBOM can include this, doesn't have to, as well as this sort of need for clarity around what the SBOM covers in terms of runtime dependencies, which might be bundled into an installer with an application. They're not in the application, but they're in the installer, right? So these are still in discussion. As long as the extent of the coverage is clear, right? If there's no attestations about runtime dependencies, and it's clear that an SBOM is about something and not the things around it, that level of detail is ultimately going to be negotiated between the supplier and the consumer. But everyone needs to understand what the SBOM covers so that there's no false negatives when a customer thinks that, well, you gave me a box and you tell me you were going to describe everything in the box, and the supplier says, well, actually, that was the packing materials. We're not, doing any attestation about that. That's something you want to know before rather than after. There's some treatment of the validation of the SBOM, which is just the format, right? Is this a valid format? How do you test that? Because you don't want to gum up the works when a format doesn't parse because it's not actually a valid format. as well as the verification of the components, which we discussed a little bit earlier. How do you understand that those are really the components? And that's an integrity issue. And then the provision of SBOMs to recipients is treated in a document from the framing group to which we make reference. And again, we get into the IP status of SBOMs because it's very important that information not stop because someone put a copyright on it, and so it can't be even imported into a third-party platform. So there's a balance in IP protection between using non-disclosures to protect information versus trying to use copyright to accomplish the same thing, which ultimately presents an obstacle to your integrators, and the ultimate customer doesn't get the information. So I think that's it for playbooks, and we can move on to the rest of the presentation and hopefully some questions.
Okay. So as we referenced earlier, we had our first ever Plug Fest and in the last month. And basically what that was doing was taking a set of projects that were out there and using it to generate source or binary software bill of materials in the different formats as examples, and using the different tools and so we wanted to have some basis there to do a compare and contrast. And for people to be able to participate, we were asking for sweat equity, and we actually got it in the sense that, if you gave us something in the directory, you were invited to the meeting. And so we had 11 tools basically producing SBOMs and 6 tools consuming them. And it was a useful, I think, well, I'll go into more details about the specifics, but we did learn a lot. And we probably even more important is, people as they were trying things out, were fixing their tools. And so that's kind of what we want. We've been taking a sort of a crawl, walk, run type of approach to this. And so these examples are all pretty straightforward and simple. And we wanted to, start there so you could have something you could compare. And the links are here if you want to go and see the actual sources. And as one of the pieces of feedback from it, we were going to be taking this same set and adding some just binaries. That was one of the requests that came in from some of the participants, possibly a container, so that we can start to look at those use cases. Now, this eye chart here basically shows you all of the organizations who actually participated with their tools. And these are the ones that were producing codes. All formats have been represented. SPX, SWID, and Cyclone DX are all there. And some did multiple, some did only one. And then some tried all the examples and some tried only 1 or 2. All of that was fine. We just wanted to have things that were a basis for comparison. And then we had various tools and companies basically working on doing the consumption of these documents and what formats could they consume. And then for which examples. So they basically used what was produced by the other participants and then consumed them in, and then did some analysis. And we basically spent a fairly productive couple of hours talking about gaps, which was the goal for this, as well as starting to have a start for the corpus. Anyhow, in summary, basically the feedback from the participants was useful, and they wanted to have the follow-on. So we'll be working, I think, looking at lining things up for June for the next one, and working with Oasis. They've got the OpenC2 group has got an event, and so Duncan's kindly offering to help us host the next one there in that framework, but it'll be open to anyone. Any tool that, anyone who's creating tools and wants to put the sweat equity in to try things, just let us know. It did flag some of the importance of having these conventions and practices around the SBOM itself. Just beyond the format, there's ways of doing things that make things easier for the tooling, and people were interpreting things a little bit differently. So having this type of plug fest really shakes that to the stuff out. Participants also discussed challenges around the packages versus the file level, as in terms of which encodings were used. The community itself has mostly seemed to be using JSON for its encodings from the tools we had up here. And as I've said, bugs got fixed, so that was good. And if you're interested in learning more about the next Plug Fest, it'll be in June. And by all means, reach out onto the formats mailing list, and join into the discussions on the call or else on the mailing list, and there'll be more details probably being made available next month. So the next steps for the project is obviously updating our 2019 white paper, making sure that the maturity of the Cyclone DX is more visible. And then a lot of things have changed. So like I say, we've got new updates to the various formats. We have new tooling and some of the interactions that you've been sort of seeing. So we'll be continuing to work on that and hopefully get that out shortly. In terms of the tools, obviously, yes, we're continuing to collect them and making sure that all the ones that are participating in the Plugfest have entries here. That's a good way of getting your tools added, is to participate in the Plugfest, because then we know you can do it. And then obviously these examples are going to continue to be built up for building up the corpus, and then identifying the gaps. The group's going to continue to work on finalizing the playbooks. They're getting pretty close, and so please, if you've got a chance, go and click on the links, read through it, make sure it makes sense to you. And if it doesn't, something's ambiguous or you've got a question, please add it in the comment right now so that we can get it addressed. And there'll probably be a review period announced for some of them. When do you think you'd want to put the review out? In the next month or so for one of them?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And we have been working, and so I think a large thanks to Steve Springett and Derek Grozowski and others in the SPDX community. So Derek's been helping us a lot with the SWID side, but we've been working on collaborations with these proof of concepts. And so and Steve's been helping them with Cyclone DX, and I and some of the other people in the SPDX community have been helping these proof of concepts with implementations and figuring out how to do things. The healthcare group has definitely been leading the way and figuring out, how they want to encode things and what makes sense. And the other area we're going to be working on is, how do we start looking at, the vulnerability and enumeration side of things and what we should be starting to look for that. So after the framing group sort of gets a point on the page for that, we'll probably try to see if we can do some surveying in terms of what's there, what's not, and what we might want to look for there. But if there are any volunteers that are interested in working on any of these above areas, by all means reach out to JC or myself, and we'll help pull you into the discussions. And if you've got feedback, we'd certainly welcome it right now.
Excellent. Thanks so much. If folks have any questions or comments, you can either share them in the chat, or if it's important, you can raise your hand and we can give you the floor. I do want to particularly flag the Plugfest as a very successful first for the SBOM community, really bringing together that many companies and projects, open source projects that are all working towards the same goal, and understanding the common benefit of saying, hey, let's make sure we've got real interoperability and a shared understanding of the problem. I think that's going to have a huge impact, especially as we prep for the next one in June. So if you are interested in joining that with, as Kate mentioned, with sweat equity, we'd love to have you participate. Oops, we have a request just to go back to the data elements slide again, sort of one of the core foundations. I think it's going to be useful. These slides, I should point out, are on the NTI website. I'll paste a link to them. But yes, this is the this is going to be the key of connecting them, and of course all of the further work in the playbook of saying, well, how do you actually do all of these?
Right. One of the things that was really useful was the exercise that the healthcare group did, which was to take these fields and say what they were pulling for to put into these fields. And so they have a way of populating that, at the next level of, we've interpreted this field to put this type of information in. And there was, there's learnings on both sides between the formats. And I expect we'll probably learn from the other groups as well. Oops. And are SBOMs generated during the Plug Fest available? Yep, they are publicly available, and the participants said they were okay with them being shared, but they are work in progress. So with that caveat. And,
No, I think, yes, thank
Go
you. It's an important caveat that this is in, this is, folks did a best effort rather than trying to be the canonical model.
Yeah, we're hoping these best efforts will eventually lead us to the canonical models. Thank you. So, yeah.
And thank you, Duncan, for sharing that link for the next Plug Fest. Really appreciate that.
Okay. And,
All right.
well then, say our next meeting is going to be on May 7th, since we're meeting this week here. And if you want to subscribe, join the Formats mailing list that's here, and you join into the thing, and we have a shared drive where we're putting a lot of the artifacts. So you've got the link to that here, and then you can navigate to the Plug Fest from there. With that, I'll stop sharing.
All right, if anyone has further questions on sort of the formats and tooling side of things, please share them in the chat and we can revisit them. I think you've now sort of gotten a great perspective of here's the high-level architecture approach of what we're trying to do. And now we talked about, hey, here's how you can actually build it. Now we're going to go further down the implementation chain to people who have actually been building this with live data on systems that are literally a matter of life and death. So you've heard us talk in the past about how impressed we are at the leadership from the healthcare sector in this space. And I think it bears repeating. It's those of you who spent time in cybersecurity don't always think of healthcare as being on the vanguard for a variety of reasons, and lack of resources is certainly one of them. So that's why I think it's particularly noteworthy that this community, and in particular, the participants of this working group and their organizations taking such leadership has been very impressive. And so I'd like to turn over to Jim Jacobson and Jennings, and I believe Ed is also going to be joining you in this conversation. So gentlemen.
Yes, he will. So I'm Jim Jacobson, head of product security for Siemens Healthineers. In phase one, we took our first steps into an SBOM proof of concept, and we succeeded in demonstrating that medical device manufacturers can deliver actionable data via SBOMs to healthcare delivery organizations. So Jennings Oski, CISO from New York Presbyterian, and I led a group of willing volunteers, pioneers, all volunteering to demonstrate that hospitals can ingest component information from their vendors in standardized formats and make security risk-based decisions. A key point that we always we've always been emphasizing is that this proof of concept did not depend on anything specific to the healthcare sector, that the findings were broadly applicable to all sectors. So that was phase one, where we proved the value of the data. And then we moved into phase two, which is the story today, really. So in phase two, our goals were proving the viability of the framing documents, minimum viable or baseline definition of component information. We wanted to expand beyond the initial proof of concept in phase one to look at extending the use cases, having additional participants from HDOs, healthcare delivery organizations, and from MDMs, medical device manufacturers, where we nearly doubled in both cases that the participants, increasing the number of SBOMs that we could test in the proof of concept. But key also was we brought in tooling and automation into the picture, and there are a number of vendors that have signed up to participate and volunteer to prove those parts of the supply chain, some supply chain information communication. So the approach that we took was a much closer collaboration with the other working groups that you've seen so far, both framing as well as the the tooling and standard definition groups. We had the focus was taking a predefined set of devices and developing SBOMs for them, executing use cases against them, including procurement use cases. And what we took in this second phase of the proof of concept is a much more iterative approach, so that we could, in each iteration, increase the exploration of various use cases, explore more speculative topics such as VEX. You'll hear a lot more about that. And we wanted to be able to publish deliverables each time we went through an iteration, so we could show the work in progress, so to speak. In iteration 1, we focused on naming based use cases. So supplier creating an SBOM and an SBOM stakeholder creating an SBOM. We were focusing primarily on the SPDX format because we're not here to necessarily endorse any one particular format, but really to use that as a vehicle to test SBOM creation, production, consumption, and use for risk management. We also confirmed the baseline elements in iteration 1. In iteration 2, we took a look at software document version, that is the version of the document itself. We looked at component completeness, getting as complete a representation of the components as possible. We looked at unique identification, creating a unique identifiers for the components, and we looked at, from the standpoint of software identity, creating a list of common components, because the manufacturers participating had components that they shared in common, and we wanted to make sure that we were using, at least within the proof of concept, consistent naming for these. We also looked at content for included components, including an SBOM document in another SBOM document, as well as looking at the system of systems approach, because in many medical devices, for instance, it's not just one computer in the picture, but there's systems of systems, multiple IT components that are present within a framework of a medical device. So we looked at that, and we looked at also creating or at least for the purposes of the proof of concept, a registry for SBOMs and how we could leverage that information. And now that catches us up to the present, and now we're embarking on iteration 3. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Ed Hireman.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate you getting us up to speed as to where we're at today. And as you've highlighted, I will now take us through on what we're doing with our iteration 3 objectives. And I work with the MDMs, and we've been evaluating the various topics that have been identified as important for SBOMs. And so in iteration 3, what we've aligned on is looking primarily then at VEX. Art gave a very good overview as to VEX and what VEX means. And so we're using that information and then the work from the subgroup that Alan is leading, that is the VEX sub working group, to explore some of those areas around VEX. And so in order to do that, we've put together some use cases. we'll be looking at the content itself. So as we're creating a VEX document, what content is needed, and then also looking at that OASIS CSF-AF format as an exploration of, once you are creating the VEX document, what formats are out there to represent the information itself. And we'll get into a little more detail here in just a little bit moment on some of this. Looking at now multiple unique identifiers, Jim highlighted that the use of Perl for the supplier identification is where we've been providing so far. But we're also going to include an identifier for the vulnerability statements that'll be made. Now, part of the POC is looking at that VEX. And so in addition, for the SBOM, we felt it's important to put a CPE as a unique identifier. Now, the reason we're using CPE is because for the purpose of the POC, we have decided to use the NVD, our National Vulnerability Database, as a vulnerability repository, just as a representation of a repository in which you may want to use as you are identifying vulnerabilities associated with the components. And in order to help simplify the use of that, the CPE provided in the SBOM then allows the HDO, or the consumer of the SBOM, to know exactly what the supplier has identified for that component. And so there should be complete agreement then on the component itself, as well as in the vulnerabilities that will be identified and understood, based on the vulnerability repository that's being used. In addition then to the VEX topics, we're going to look at component hash, understanding what a component hash means, in the context, not of just the SBOM, putting it into the SBOM, but how it would be generated by the supplier, as well as used or consumed by, in our case, the HDOs. We hope to look at an additional SBOM format. We've already highlighted the use of SPDX and SWID, and now we'll also be looking at Cyclone DX as another format to explore, to confirm and understand, can it also represent SBOM content? File naming was something that the HDOs highlighted as something for us to explore. And the SBOM file naming is really nothing more than establish some conventions for the naming of the SBOM document itself, that ideally then can make it easier as an HDO collects numerous SBOMs from its medical device manufacturers, the ability to use the name of the document to help you understand what SBOM goes with what medical device. And then as a final goods assembler, and as MDMs, identifying components that are in the product itself, part of the kind of responsibility of the MDM, or final goods assembler, is to actually use the SBOM of the included components to understand what are those vulnerabilities, in addition to other monitoring they may be doing. So we're going to take a look to see what are lessons learned, what's our experience with actually acquiring SBOMs for the included components, and then consuming or ingesting those ourselves to see what type of experience we have with that. And then finally, as part of iteration 3, we're looking at that MDM how-to guide for the healthcare POC. This was highlighted earlier, by part of the formats and tooling of putting things together that make it easier easier for all the interested parties that are trying to understand what are we doing as part of the proof of concept, and more important, what are we doing as part of the NTIA. And here's information that ideally allows them to sit down and understand really what's it take to create an SBOM. And as Jim was highlighting previously, even this is our kind of a part of our healthcare experience, or focused on our healthcare experience. It really should be information that applies to anyone going down the path of, hey, I want to better understand the mechanics of what it takes to actually produce the SBOM itself. All right. I mentioned, the importance of VEX with this particular iteration. And so, use cases are what we're using to drive, our focus and the activities we're doing to understand and evaluate this concept of VEX. And so the use cases, these are the 5 use cases that we've identified. They were assembled with the, not only based on discussions of the MDMs and HDOs, but also even understanding some of the areas that were being identified as part of the VEX subgroup itself. So first one is a vulnerability component that is not included in the medical device. In essence, this allows an MDM or a supplier to make a statement that this particular vulnerability is not in my device or maybe multiple devices because that component is not being used. Now, ideally, you could possibly discover that by consuming the SBOM, but there are still common events that occur in the industry in which whether it's a WannaCry or some of the more recent ones, that individuals using that particular medical device want to know upfront, hey, am I impacted or not? And this is a way to do that without them necessarily having to go through, acquire an SBOM or do additional work with that. They ideally would have the VEX itself and could understand it just with the VEX. The vulnerability component is under investigation. The thought here being in some of these, it may take some time for the supplier or MDM to determine whether that vulnerability is actually impacting the product. So this would provide the ability for the MDM to provide some interim information to the HDO. And then medical device pre-procurement, that's an important part of the HDO processes of identifying medical devices that will be acquired and brought into their institution. So certainly want to make sure that the things we do around VEX for the proof of concept also consider the pre-procurement process. And then finally, the last two last two use cases are really the prime of use cases for the VEX and understanding vulnerabilities, because this gets back to those questions that Art had highlighted earlier of, is this component an impact to the medical device or not? And so these two use cases are directly around a vulnerability in a component that does not impact the medical device, meaning there are no actions the HDO needs to take to mitigate that vulnerability, or the vulnerability does impact it. And in that case, as MDMs, we'll be recommending actions that the HDO can perform to further mitigate it. And it's important to note that these are recommended actions, and there's certainly additional work that the HDOs may take as they fully evaluate and understand and assess the true nature of that vulnerability in their environment. But at least these two use cases are the primary ones of where we as MDMs can provide that understanding of the vulnerability in the context of our medical device and really what that means for the HDO. And then next is looking at some detail in the VEX content. So once again, we are heavily partnering and collaborating with the VEX subgroup of the framing working group, making sure we understand what content they feel is important. And then we also have an opportunity then in the POC to identify other content that maybe they haven't considered, and we can contribute to ultimately establishing a baseline of VEX content similar to the work that was done for the framing document for the SBOM. So general information that we've established already, some type of document identity, making sure it's understood, for this particular VEX document, what its name, version, author, things like that, so you understand what it's about and who it came from. And then we get into the product itself. So for the POC, we have scoped this that there will only be a single product in a VEX document. So this really aligns it well then with the concept of we have SBOMs that are for a medical device. So, with this, taking this approach, we thought it was important at least to first focus on, the medical device and then a companion VEX document that goes with it. And so in order to establish the relationship, we also felt it's important to have or make use of the software identity of the primary component. Now, the primary component for an SBOM is the thing that the SBOM is describing. And so, within the POC, we have looked at various approaches for establishing that software identity. And so the idea is to take those same approaches that we use for the SBOM and apply them to the VEX so that it's very easy to use, between the two documents to quickly understand, oh, it's this, it's the primary component of this SBOM, and it's also that primary component that's identified in the VEX. So therefore, you easily know that those two documents go together. Then, the VEX content will also contain information about the vulnerability in which the statement is going to be applied to. And once again, kind of referring back to the SBOM and maintaining that relationship with the SBOM, this means that, it's going to be about vulnerabilities associated with those included components from the SBOM, or really even the primary component. But primarily we're looking at for the proof of concept, the included component. And once again, we're using that same information that's in the SBOM, the software identity information, and that same information will be present in the VEX document. Highlighted previously that part of the information about the vulnerability will be including a unique identifier that's associated for the included component. So in our case, the CPE. And then the actual identifier for the vulnerability itself. And because we have decided to make use of the NBD, then that means we'll be including the CV information also. And then you have the vulnerability statement information itself. So a vulnerability status. So that's the status associated with the impact of the vulnerability itself as assessed and evaluated against the product and the use of that particular included component, with the product itself. And so we will be using those coded values that were described earlier. Is it known and affected, known not affected? So that's certainly an area where we want to align with the work that's been done on establishing the SBOM content. And then in addition, we feel it's important to be able to add impact statements, which at least currently are nothing more than textual descriptions of, why has this a status of known affected or known not affected been applied. And this really is the point where the supplier, or in our case the MDM, has an opportunity to explain and somewhat provide context as to why that particular selection was determined. And certainly in the case where it's known not affected, this is where you can highlight compensating controls, other things such as that is actually a feature that's not in use, or that code was not included as part of the compilation. Some of those things that were discussed earlier as to why a known not affected would be the appropriate assessment. In addition then to having just the status and that statement itself, we're going to explore providing what we've termed as a resulting risk score. So this would be the risk score associated with the vulnerability in the context of the product or primary component itself. So this is a risk score that would take into consideration some of the mitigating controls and other factors that are associated with the medical device. And we felt this would be good to explore because a rubric has been put in place for use with medical devices to make use of CVSS 3.0 on how to, guidance on how to establish those scores for the medical device. And the things such as the CVSS score are also very important and oftentimes used by the consumers, and in our case the HDOs, to further quantify and understand the risk level. So this may give us an opportunity as MDMs to put some type of objective measure as well, in addition to the assessment, coded value and impact statements that we put together. And then finally, it's the last set of information would be consumer action. And in essence, what is it that the HDO needs to do, based on the assessment that has been provided or the statement that has been made. And certainly this is very important if it's a known affected, because this may recommend actions that such as whether it's the patching or other things that could be done to mitigate to further mitigate the risk associated with that vulnerability. All right, so distribution of the VEX itself, those VEX statements, I've kind of alluded to it previously. This is going to be maintained in a separate VEX document. So there will be a VEX document that is associated with the SBOM, and we've discussed how the relationship between those two documents will be established through those software identities that will be present in both documents to make it easier to navigate and understand what statements go with what product. These will be located in a box restricted folder. This is exactly what we're doing today with the SBOMs, and part of that is there is an NDA in place so that only those MDMs and HDOs that are actively engaged with the generation and consumption of the SBOMs and now the VEX documents, they have access to that restricted folder. It's going to be available in the same folder as the SBOM documents itself. Jim talked about we've created a registry in which we had added the SBOM documents to make it easier for the HDOs to know what SBOMs were available. So we'll update that registry with the VEX documents also. So once again, just a way to make it easier, certainly for the POC. Maybe it has some applicability down the road as well, but for the POC, making it easier for our HDOs who are participating to know what documents are going to be applicable for them. And then one thing to kind of highlight too is we really feel that the VEX document that we're going to create could be considered to be issued at the point in time that the product released, or as part it was something that was released or generated after the product was released, or a post-release situation. We don't see any difference, at least in the moment or at the moment, that you couldn't use that, consider it to being used at certain points in time. And so part of this does kind of work well then with the pre-procurement processes that the HDOs have, and they can kind of use these in a different manner depending on whether they want to, they're executing maybe a pre-procurement use case, or if they're actually executing a use case where they already have the medical device and now are obtaining a VEX for something that's in their environment currently. Okay, so wanted to highlight then some of the documents and resources that are now available as part of the work we've been participating in. There is a how-to guide for the healthcare POC SBOM. That's in progress. We hope to have that completed here shortly and have that available for everyone to review. And that will certainly be one of the part of the complete set of documents that was presented before as part of the overall idea of having playbooks. And so this really is intended to be almost a step-by-step of what's needed to generate an SBOM. And as I discussed previously, we feel even though it's targeted at healthcare, it's really something that's going to apply to other industries as well. We currently have SBOM examples for both SPDX and SWID. Just a very simple, straightforward example to help understand. This is what it looks like. Once you take that content and put it into an SPDX format, for example. Talked previously about this notion of medical device system of systems. We've got examples for those to help understand some of the deployment configurations and ways to approach the SBOM generation when you have the system of systems. SBOM registry we just talked about. Previously, there was discussions. Kate and JC, talked about some of the tooling that's available. We're certainly leveraging some of those, such as the SBOM and even certainly the conformance tools that are out there with SPDX and SWID. And we also have an Excel SPDX generator that's been developed as part of our MDM SBOM generation. So it's something that, very simple, very straightforward, that helped us to create some SPDX SBOMs, and that's something then that we're making available as part of all of our documentation and in Box as well. And then we've done some initial work now for VEX. So those scenarios or use cases that I discussed, we have a document that goes into significantly more detail about those. Basically, step-by-step descriptions for each of those use cases we discussed. And then we have a simple VEX content example. It's not in any particular format such as CSAF yet, but it is a document that we use just to capture, based on the content that I described earlier, based on our discussions then with the VEX subgroup, here's what we think the VEX content would look like, just in some simple, almost a tag value representation that would then be easy for us to take that and actually use it as a source as we make our way through, for example, establishing what it would look like in CSAF. Now, I think we still have a few more minutes, so what I'd like to do is show you some of the work that we've done with these resources. And I do want to highlight that all of those resources that I discussed are available to everyone. They are in our Box location in the area that everyone has access to. And certainly if anyone has trouble accessing Box, it's something we will coordinate and make sure is made available. So what I'm showing now is that how-to document we put together, and just kind of highlight some of the chapters and content that's there. A section on SBOM basics. What's it mean for the SBOM itself, what it's supposed to do. Then collecting SBOM content, how you can go about working internally to get that information. Certainly one of the more challenging, I think, aspects of SBOMs today, because most of us don't have things in place yet to do that. I think in the future we will. That'll make it easier. But certainly some avenues you can take right now that really gets you to a point in time where you can get those first SBOMs out the door. Now, the generation guidance, that really gets into those specific details around the various elements, the various content that's required for the SBOM, and how to approach some of these more challenging areas such as software identity, unique identifiers, some approaches you can take for establishing those, what can be done around SBOM completeness. So these are all important topics that have been identified, both as part of the framing group, as well as then just some of the things we've encountered that are part of our medical devices. And as I highlighted, although it's somewhat of a medical device perspective, you can see where really all of this would apply to other types of systems, whether it's Internet of Things, et cetera, that have some of the same consideration. So this really gets into providing some of that experience that we've had and recommendations on what we've done and how we've approached it. And then finally, there's chapters on each of the formats and kind of walking you through what elements, for example, of SPDX do you use when you're representing certain information that has been identified for the SBOM. And same thing then for the SWID. Examples are sprinkled throughout, and there's a complete example included in the document itself. Once again, both SPDX and SWID, similar information. So depending on which ones you might want to explore, ideally you've got everything you need to make your way through this, and this can guide you on generating that content in the particular format. A little bit then on some of the generation, how we approach the generation, and certainly just some quick links to tooling that we used. And many of those, it's really those same tools I previously discussed, but giving you some references on how to get those and how to use them. And then finally, felt it would be good to include that system of system example, background on it, as well as then a diagram that kind of shows from a medical device perspective when you start encountering systems of systems, and then once again a set of examples that highlights for this particular example and approach what would an SBOM look like, and what does that content actually look like. So really just working on putting the final touches on that, and get that in the hands of the formats and tooling group to make that available to to the NTI initiative and community as a whole. And then one very last thing I wanted to show you. I think we're just about out of time. This is the example document, SPDX example, similar to what's in the playbook. And then here's the VEX example that we've put together. So these are the documents we're using to help us understand and make our way through formalizing that content for iteration 3. And as I said, this is all publicly available. So eventually this will make its way into Box for everyone to have access to. Okay. And that wraps it up, I think, for me, Jim.
Thanks, Ed. I really appreciate that. And certainly a lot that's being worked on. Jennings, I wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity in case you had any closing words to.
Well, thanks, Jim, and thanks, Ed. Your leadership has been awesome. I'd like to thank the entire working group. This has been a really wonderful experience collaborating with everyone. I think that what we're showing is that SBOMs are doable. And really, I think the learnings of this POC have informed the other groups. They've had an influence on the FDA. I'm hopeful they'll have an influence on any federal discussions around SBOMs and the role to play for federal government, and also possibly broader regulations around SBOMs. That's just kind of my hope for this. When we started doing this work, there was concerns expressed about whether or not this was doable, how it would scale. And I think the great thing we're showing is that the standards, as they exist today, will allow for the creation of meaningful SBOMs. And we look forward to keeping the ball moving forward and partnering with the other work groups to advance the use of SBOMs across the globe. So with that, I'll stop there.
Alan, back to you.
Well, thank you, everyone. And by now you've got a sense of a couple things. First of all, just how much work has been happening over the last few months. Even when you look back over the last 2.5 years, the pace of change has been accelerating, and the community has been keeping up with that. 2, you're also seeing how these different work streams interact and build on each other. So the healthcare group is building on the work the framing group has done, and the formats group has done, and that work in turn is going to feed back into the other working groups. And I think that's, again, helps underscore the value of this approach. We know that not everyone can join all of the working groups, but you can at least track the different moving pieces based on what it was that you identified. So what we're going to do now is take a quick break. We are going to, key for any virtual meeting is to make sure that folks can actually stretch and get some coffee and take care of other Maslow hierarchies. And we will reconvene at 2:10 Eastern. And hang on just a second, we'll put that up on the screen. But in the meantime, either hang out or join back in a moment. And we look forward to continuing the conversation after the break. We're going to hear from awareness and adoption. We're going to hear about some of the other nascent proof of concept work. And then we're going to have a chance to say, hey, what aren't we doing? What needs to come next? So thanks, and we'll talk in about 15 minutes. And just one last thing, we will begin promptly at 2:10 p.m. Eastern. Thank you.